I think we understand is that persecution, in fact, nothing can stop the movement of God. In fact, sometimes persecution amplifies the movement of God. Let's just talk about this for a second. The moral collapse of ministry after ministry after ministry in our age is discouraging. That the church is now unstoppable because it is implanted in every single disciple of Jesus Christ. It's one of the unbelievable experiences that still we see across the globe today. When persecution comes, the church actually thrives and grows. Not that any of us should be praying for persecution, but what I think we understand is that persecution, in fact, nothing can stop the movement of God. In fact, sometimes persecution amplifies the movement of God. And today I just want to look at a couple of interesting points about what happens when this first persecution happens, to see if we can get ourselves back together around the movement of what was happening as opposed to the institution that we've been so used to in the church. First thing I want to say, which is probably going to confuse you, is this. When we centralize the church, we get actually a spider instead of a starfish. Some of you are saying, what in the world are you talking about? Now, I want to remind you of something that we forget. If you look at the book of Acts, all throughout the book of Acts, and really throughout the New Testament, you have both churches meeting in large gatherings like this, but also the church meets from house to house. They were meeting together in great numbers, but they were also meeting together on a regular basis. In fact, the Acts chapter 2 says they met daily. They were meeting regularly. So there was a sense in which that I think we read from our context into the scripture, we think, oh, they were doing church like us. No, they weren't. They were living together as the church in their homes, in their communities, and they were gathering together as they could and as they needed to celebrate together. So there was the church wasn't as centralized in any part of the New Testament as we have kind of thought about it today. And so that's what I want to emphasize. There were multiple leaders, multiple functions going on. The church was dispersed even in the city, and there's an explosion of people coming to faith. Now, here's why I've used this, and it's not new with me. I'm copying someone else, a great book that I read recently. But this idea of a spider and a starfish. So this is what I mean. If you cut a spider in half, guess what you get? You get a dead spider. If you cut a starfish in half and throw it back in the ocean, guess what you get? There you go. So what you and I need to remember is that if persecution were to break out today in this country, and somehow the government was to shut all the church, it's no longer legal to gather, what would we do? How would we accomplish this? Because we've become so centralized and we've credentialed all of our leaders, we wouldn't probably know what to do. Think about this. What happened in the pandemic? We were trying to figure this out. And we still relied on the centralization of the church, right? We still relied on being able to go to our TV or our computer and getting somehow teaching and feeding from the central producing part of the church. But we've failed to see what God has already kind of given us a picture of, but we have missed it or we've forgotten it. And that is that God wanted the church to be more like a starfish than he did a spider. This corporate structure that we have, I'm sure that you are as dismayed as I am. Let's just talk about this for a second. The moral collapse of ministry after ministry after ministry in our age is discouraging. Now, what happens there? I don't have an answer for all of it, but what I can tell you is that when we keep centralizing bigger and bigger, putting more power and authority in celebrity pastors' hands, no human being can handle that. That's not what God intended. And so we've got to rethink this and say, what is it that we should be doing? What's the DNA? Because if the DNA, listen to me, if the DNA of the church is not alive in every one of you, then we're doing something wrong. Because that's how a starfish can be cut in half, or you can cut one of the legs off or whatever. It will it's the DNA is so there. In a spider, that's not the case. So we've got to think, how can we organize ourselves in such a way, if we want to see movement, we've got to organize ourselves in such a way that every single part of the church has the DNA of the whole church within it. So that if something happens, and when something happens, and maybe I should say it's not if, it's when. As we respond to what reality is and what the culture is doing and what our circumstances are, that the church is now unstoppable because it is implanted in every single disciple of Jesus Christ. Look with me at verse 4. I love this. Now, remember, the curious thing about this is that the only people who don't leave, it says that everyone was scattered, except who? The credentialed people, right? The ones that you would think like, wow, why don't they leave? Now, there's lots of thoughts about this. Some would say that there was more of a push against the Hellenistic, the Greek Jews than there was against those who were more of the Hebraic sect. And so it wasn't that all the Jews, all the Christians scattered. It was just those who didn't have a Jewish background or a strong Jewish background. There's no good answer, in my opinion, for this. But I tell you what, I think it's curious. I think it's curious that the apostles don't leave. Maybe they stayed to care for those who remained. Maybe God said to them, I told you to wait until things happen there, so you keep waiting. I don't know. We don't know. But what I do know is every person scatters except them. And then look at verse 4. And those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. Now, I don't like the word preached there because I think that I'm afraid we'll hear it as if, oh, they were preachers. They just proclaimed, they just lived out the message in the way that they knew how to do that because the DNA of the church had been implanted in them. And that's what I want you to think about here, is that they go and they basically live in such a way because they can't deny what they've experienced. And so they're proclaiming the truth of their life now wherever they go. And God is using their testimony, their witness, to disperse the whole of the church across the globe. It's a fascinating thing to see what basically happens. So here's what I want to say. I want to ask you to think through this with me, that you would carry the DNA of the whole church in you in such a way that if God moved you to a place where there wasn't a church, you would be the church.